Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for being here today. Today Steve and I are going to talk about Death in Velvet by Rose Donovan. Unfortunately, Rose couldn't be here with us today, so you get to enjoy the two of us rambling on about a story that we absolutely adored. And I just want to kick this off by saying I am not somebody who reads a lot of mystery, who reads a lot of detective novels in particular. I was never a big Sherlock Holmes person growing up, but this was such a breath of fresh air from what I would have normally anticipated this genre to be. And it was nice to kind of follow along and then go, oh, the person I thought was the criminal, the person I thought was the murderer actually died. So it was nice to see the ever evolving, not just state of the story, but the ever evolving state of myself trying to discover the story. It felt like a puzzle book almost going on.
And in juxtaposition to you finding it a breath of fresh air, I found it so familiar, and I think that was part of why I liked it. But then I did grow up watching Sherlock Holmes movies, read some of the books, but especially what this gave me more was Diagnosis Murder, Murder She Wrote, all these old mystery shows and stuff. You know, a bit of Poirot, maybe not so much Columbo, but the same idea. And I'm a big fan of those kind of those shows and those books where you've got a detective who doesn't have the powers that a police detective might have, where they got to get by on wits. And I think there was Psych. Psych was really good as well. Anything where you've got someone who's not a detective being a detective out of their depth, I'm a huge fan of. I think this one had that. Was this the first book in the series? I can't remember.
This is book one, yeah, Partners in Spying.
And then there's sequels. I love that it's already got a kind of established background lore. Oh yeah, these girls have done this before. They've had little adventures like this. This isn't anything massively new for them, but it's new for us. I really love that part of it. It felt like a really good 6-part series, maybe.
Well, you can also tell that it takes a turn because you have the kind of political drama, imperialism going on in the background that they hinted at in this story that I assume is going to play a larger role in future books. But one of the things I absolutely loved, and this is such a small detail, like I'm such a big fan of maps and books and stuff like that because I always go back and reference, but this having a character, like kind of the cast page with little explanations of who everybody is, it makes such a difference, especially with somebody like especially for a reader like myself that can easily get overwhelmed with names and whatnot. It made it so nice just to be able to scroll back and see, oh, okay. And it's the little details like that that play a really huge, like really big role for my own personal experience. But I am curious how big of a role it plays going forwards and how similar or different the cast becomes as the story or as the series evolves.
Yes, it feels like the kind of thing that will have a great rotating cast of recurring characters. I think all the best mysteries do. Like guest characters almost that you're always like, hey, when they come on.
Mm-hmm.
Which, speaking of the cast list, I guess this ties into the same vibe, which was that when I saw the kind of cast list at the start, it gave me the sense that I was about to get into almost like a bit of theatre, like a play.
Yeah.
And I think the book's kind of deliberately structured around these specific scenes and one location between a bunch of characters trying to figure something out. The way that movement in the scene is described and everything, it gave me a very kind of theatrical feeling. Having the cast list for that as well, but I think that's to its strength. That it feels like a little contained kind of short theatre piece that you'd watch in a couple of separate sittings.
Yeah, no, and I think just to add to that, yeah, now that I actually reflect on it, it does feel that way. There's the scenes in the hotel, there's the scenes at the party, and it's kind of one after the other. But it was really nice the way it opened because it didn't open in a way that I would have otherwise anticipated it to. Opening with a problem that ends up being completely different to everything else that the team is going to face the next 200 or so pages. Um, and I thought that was fun because I think more than anything, at least for myself, it really helped me set the scene and it really helped put me in the character's mindset because this wasn't on the foremost of their mind. They were focusing on other aspects of their life and this and that. And then they kind of get thrown into it. Albeit they took it with a pip in their step and they were excited to try to solve this, but you can tell it wasn't their first and foremost priority of the weekend, as it were.
Yeah, I really like that. It took the comfy level up a little bit. That the stakes most of the time were not kind of major life or death stakes, at least not for the main cast. They were coming into something else that was happening and that kind of affected them and pulled them in. Try and avoid spoilers for now, I guess. But the mystery as it unraveled and pulled them in, I felt like was of even importance to them getting what they wanted out of the weekend. You know, getting a foot into the door of the fashion world and everything. Which is another thing that I'd love to talk about the setting itself. The the murder at the fashion show, great idea already, but like I'd a couple of days before this, I had watched House of Gucci for the first time. I'd never seen it before. I think it was on something. I ended up watching it. And I thought it was great, but I really loved the elegance of everything and the scenery and the pageantry and everything.
Mhm.
It's like an almost a perfect place to set a really seedy murder with a lot of corruption and double crossing and stuff going on.
And I think just in the greater context of the environment that they're in, because this is what the 1930s, they're in France, and tensions are starting to rise around Europe and stuff. So you kind of have the quiet part spoken out loud, where people are trying to distance themselves from I guess, the reality that's going on around them. But then I think there was a quote from Omar, was it, where it was just like, it's here, whether or not you want to accept it, like, this is the reality and you can't run from it.
I really love the historical backdrop. The time period of the 30s is really cool anyway. There's a lot of cool aesthetics and stuff going on. Uh, Even if the world was a bit of a state at that time. But that informs really well into it. It's like this thing lurking in the background. You know, the readers know what's happening in 1939,
Yeah.
but characters don't. And to them, it's still on the way. It's on the horizon. There's a real sense of kind of like impending disasters through a lot of it, but it's subtle and it's underplayed and it's just in the background. But I really liked how, speaking of war and everything, the cast lent itself quite well to being a kind of geopolitics in miniature.
Mm.
You've got the Americans and stuff there. You know, you obviously get the French and everything. People from all over the place, kind of crossing loyalties and questioning each other.
Well, there was a lot of question regarding loyalty throughout the novel, because I didn't know who was on whose team. Right. And there were points where towards the end I was questioning whether or not the detective really had their best interests at heart. Um,
Oh yeah,
I'm trying to think of, and this is why the little cash sheet is so helpful. I believe it was Elizabeth, the American, who was, I think,
yeah.
from the get-go left an impression. And I didn't expect that kind of, I guess, outlook from her. I didn't expect that to be where her story would lead.
Well, it draws attention to the kind of skill that went into introducing all of the characters. This is something that I think a lot of mystery writers get wrong, is that they feel that they need a big cast. And for a mystery, you need a larger than usual cast. You can't have a mystery with two people, not without getting weird. I'll stop before I go on a tangent. But you need to have those characters be very distinct and memorable pretty much immediately. If you look at any Agatha Christie story, then you know if you think of Murder on the Orient Express, everyone has a defining characteristic. You would know them by things like their footsteps, their body language, but just who they are, their appearance, and everything. And the way they're introduced, you see them doing what they do. So the way that Elizabeth was introduced, for example, I think is she intervening to save them from a taxi crash.
I think it was either, yeah, it was. She got involved
Right
because
at the start.
Ruby and Fina got in a car accident, and then the taxi driver was yelling at them, and she just kind of whisked them away, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, things like that. You're already showing us who the characters are. You remember that woman for the rest of the story, which is good because she's very important, obviously. But things like that, even like some of the minor characters, the way that they're described, it's almost like you're given not a caricature because that would imply that it's not effective, I guess, but just a really strong sense of what people look like, act like, feel like, so that next time you see that name, you can populate the scene much easier. And for scenes like, you know, the big dinner room scene where they're going back and forth with accusations and stuff after the first murder, uh, scenes like that would fall apart if you weren't able to follow who was talking to who and what the motivations might.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with that. I think because as a reader, I struggle with large casts, which again is why the cast list is so great. But each, whether they be minor or major, it was easy to follow who was who, and Rose did such a good job of creating personalities for each character. Like no one felt like filler. Like um even when the murder happened, and sorry boys, spoilers, uh even when the murder happened at the runway, um what was her name? Because that led me directly to thinking,
Started with a name.
oh, it has to be based on what we know about these people. It has to be Bertha. It has to be Bertha. It has to be Bertha or Henriette or
Oh yeah,
I think it was Henriette. I thought it was Henriette until Henriette died. If
yeah.
I'm remembering this correctly, and if I'm not, I do apologize. Um, but it was nice to have such kind of adamant conclusions on my own end, only 50 pages into a story based on what had already been shared with me, you know? Like those
Yeah,
personalities really grew quickly.
I had a little note on my phone when I take notes obviously through all the books that I read for this, and the note on my phone had about 7 different guesses at who it was. I like to just track who I think it is in a mystery, you know. And yeah, you're right. After every like, was it the girl came stumbling out the room and it was Bertha, and even just to what we were talking about earlier, Bertha immediately in my head. I'm like, oh, the wee maid, the
Yeah.
wee maid lady at the head of the thing. Yeah, I can already see her scurrying about, trying to make a run for it and stuff. Uh, these scenes are still stuck in my head because they were so vividly described. I found most of the book like that. It was like just little key moments where I was like, aha, there it is. We've got them. That's who it is. And then it's turned again. And to keep a mystery engaging, you know, obviously if it's guessable within the first 50 pages, you're probably not doing a great job of, unless it's deliberate, hiding.
No, exactly that. And I think, and I don't know how accurate this is, but I feel like the types of descriptions and the amount of descriptions and just how the story was written was really fitting for a piece that took place in this time period. Like I think we have a, if you go on the YPQ's website, you'll see on one of our blog posts that we do have a Q&A with Rose, the author. And so we'll reference back and forth to that throughout. But one of the questions, or one of the things that she was saying, was that she just loves the golden age of detective fiction and the art style and the complexities of the 1930s, because at that time, and these are her words, but that period saw many independence movements and upheavals in response to the British and other empires, which really helps with the political background of the story, which Rose hinted at throughout, with both the accompanying note, as this is something, as Ruby is somebody who's under watch from the government, and also just the general context, because this is Paris 1936. Like things are starting to heat up a little bit. You still have the what was it, Roaring Twenties, Great Depression leading into World War II, and unfortunately, Paris was smack in the middle of all that.
Yeah, I'd be really excited to see where Rose goes with that in the future. Obviously, the sequels are on my TBR now because I really enjoyed this. I'm sure I'd asked her in our questions about how to avoid falling into the trap of formula. You know, a
Yeah,
lot of mysteries, especially running mysteries and stuff, fall into the trap of repeating the same formula over and over because it works. You see it with serials on TV. Like if I watch an episode of CSI, I know what's going to happen in it. It's the same thing that happens every episode.
it's such a difficult thing, because I'm the same way. I used to watch, not detective stuff, but fun fact, I used to watch Survivor religiously, and
Oh yeah,
it got to a point where, based on the camera shots, the angles they would use, I could figure out who was going home within the first 5 minutes of the episode, and then I stopped watching because it was just, well, I've solved the puzzle. Um,
yeah.
I'm going through and I'm trying to figure out what question that was, because she did give a good answer to it. Um,
Hit him with that control F, man.
The question was, the mystery had us guessing for most of the novel, and we're curious how you construct your mysteries. Do you start at the end, and what's your process like? And she said, believe it or not, I never know the killer when I start. What I do know are the characters, the settings, the victim, and the victims, and how the murder will occur. As you know, most mysteries have a second murder, which is also a mystery to me when I begin. I construct the story so everyone is a possible murderer. As I near the end of the first draft, I get a sense of who it will be. Then I usually change my mind. After that. The challenge of doing it like this is that it requires a lot of revision to make sure everything lines up, but I'm not sure I could do it any other way. If I know the killer before I begin, I lose the excitement of writing and tend to subconsciously lay too many clues about it as I write, which makes a lot of sense, genuinely, just in terms of, like when you're trying to keep a lie, you're trying to keep a secret, you end up alluding to it too much and this and that. As I think she did a phenomenal job because, again, you and I were both guessing throughout. And frankly, I think the murder itself was really unique. Um, I thought that was very clever, and I loved the detective scene of them running around the hotel rooms trying to find outlets and this and that. I thought that was really, really fun for us as readers. Maybe not so much for them as characters, but yeah, it was very unique in that regard, and I'm excited to read the sequels and the follow-ups because I'm sure that they will continue with that, especially if her process is that kind of different or unique.
Authors get asked all the time if they are planners or pantsers, which I'm sure we've asked people in here as well. It just means, do you fly by the seat of your pants and make it up as you go, or do you plan it out? And I think most of us fall somewhere in between. But flying by the seat of your pants for a mystery is bold, but it definitely worked. I don't know how many authors could pull it off because of how many little interconnected things there are between so many characters. But you would end up going back to put revisions in anyway. So hats off, hats off to Rose for constructing a really coherent mystery. It certainly worked if you look at how many possible suspects were in my notes as I was reading it. That I wasn't sure who it could have been. And I guess retroactively kind of doing it like that is going to make sure that you as a writer want to just get to the next scene and get to the next revelation of information as well, which is what drives a mystery. I think it's maybe why the pace was so bang on. And the pace was fantastic. It never really let up.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, like if she doesn't know who's going to be the murderer, we're not going to know who's going to be the murderer. And it could come down to the night before. It's a change here, a change there. I'm personally imagining this giant whiteboard with lines everywhere and string attached and all these connections because I can only imagine the revision process, especially if you're taking the self-publishing route and you don't have the resources of an entire publishing team
Yeah.
behind you to triple check, quadruple check, everything like that.
I often wonder how many writers of like great success whose fandoms will come up with like theories and stuff like that. Like Game of Thrones had so many of this or so much of this. I always wonder if they're tempted to just take those theories and conspiracies and go, "Yep, that one sounds good. That's pretty cool."
I mean, we can definitely follow up with her and ask. That's a great question. I
Yeah, man.
I love the whole is it deliberate and well, it's about to be like
The fear that she has as well about subliminally giving away the mystery is so true. Like, I don't want to spoil my own books, God. The first rule has a big twist in it at the end. And when I was going through the drafts, see, like unconscious things like word choice, when you're describing a scene, I was like, every time I describe this guy, I just make it sound like he's so obviously not who he says he is. And you have to go back and do that. You have to go back and fix all that anyway. Not knowing is like a good double blind for making sure that you don't.
yeah. Yeah, no, and I think like she said, she wrote it going into it with the possibility of everybody being the murderer. And I think that's really, really nice because this way it really lets the reader come up with their own ideas versus, oh, it was never gonna be them, it was never gonna be them. which I'm quite fond of. And if you look at the cast list, you can see that at the bottom there's Attila, which is the hotel's cat. So that's technically a character in this, and you never know because I'm pretty sure the
A
cat.
suspect.
I think the cat played a role when they were on the.
Yeah.
Was it a houseboat?
I think so, yeah.
I love that scene.
Yeah, it kind of felt like a game of Cluedo come to life. In
Yeah,
Cluedo, you're not
yeah,
really
yeah.
sure who the murderer is until the end. It's a process of elimination kind of thing.
But then there was also the scenes where Ruby was so confident, and I'm sitting here being like, "How are you calm? I'm reading the same thing that you're living right now, and I'm not following these bits. What am I missing?" And it was interesting to see that I was pretty confident it wouldn't have been Ruby, but there was a moment where I was like, "Ooh, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
This isn't
If
looking
it makes
great
you doubt,
for her."
then it's doing its job, right?
No, exactly. So it is really cool to see such a unique mystery novel or such a unique, I guess, more detective novel take place in a traditional, like in a self-publishing environment, because again, like Rose would not have had the same resources as a J.K. Rowling would have had to double check all of this and that throughout.
Yeah, I liked how they had to overcome problems without the advantages of like money or physical power or violence or anything. They couldn't really use any of the typical ways that a detective gets out of problems. They had to use their wits and charm their way into things and talk their way into things. And I really talking about those moments where Ruby's so confident of something. The big monologues, I think, are one of those defining features of a good detective novel, where the detective lays out the thought process
Yeah.
for the reader. Here's how I came to this conclusion, and the reader has to be able to follow it. And I love them, and I wonder how that played out if Rose is mostly like discovery writing, where she's not sure of what's coming next, and I wonder what's going through her head when she gets to those scenes, because maybe they took a lot of editing after the fact, probably, but they played out so smoothly for me. I love when a detective takes you through the whole thing, start to finish, and it's like, I've put it together. And then as a reader, you're sitting going, well, that might be wrong. Maybe I think that confident about this fact, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But the discovery writing kind of style of doing it, it must be it must be surprising sometimes to see what comes out of the characters' mouths when they come to that.
I can imagine. And oh shoot, what was the point I wanted to make on top of that was that I lost it. I absolutely lost it. Uh, um, but yeah, no, you're so right. When you have that kind of moment where everything comes together. Oh, that's what I want to say. It's it's really nice when I read a story like this, and my immediate reaction is, I want to reread this and see what I missed. I want
Yeah,
to read this and see, like, oh, was this hinted at in the first couple of chapters? Did I completely, like, what were the breadcrumbs thrown in there? Um, because I love doing that, because then you reread it with a completely different scope, and you can see, oh, this is why this character is doing this, or this is why they did this instead of that. Um, and yeah, it plays a big role. One speaking of characters, one of the ones that I love that we haven't talked about, because well, I mean, we haven't talked about a lot of them. There's a lot of characters in this.
there's a lot.
Um, I loved Pixley.
Oh, Pix is excellent. He was one of my favourites because of the the way that he's described, and they're always ragging on him for being bald and stuff. In my head, Danny DeVito for most of the book, for all of the book, it was so fantastic because he's the not the butt of jokes, but because he's the heel. He's the kind of foil in terms of his banter, and he'll the conversations between him and the girls were so much fun to read. A little bit like watching like a good episode of Will and Grace, where they're just tearing into each other, especially in like their fashion and everything. But I loved all of his parts of the story. I thought he was great.
I thought it was a really nice kind of. I feel like all stories need the comedic elements. All stories need that little breath of fresh air, for lack of a better word, to kind of get rid of all the tension that's been building up. But there was a lot of characters in here that played such important roles. Like you had the actual owner of the fashion
Oh
design,
yeah,
fashion house, everything like that. And then obviously you have Omar, the front desk. You have the what was her name? I have it here. Matilda Lafitte. So she was the owner
Oh,
of
yeah.
the fashion house, but then you had her husband, Leo Fisher, who right off the bat, he's suspicious because that man has an agenda.
Oh yeah, he's running around with ladies and stuff that aren't his wife. Yeah, the minute you start seeing characters who don't know that they're being watched, another mystery staple, another detective staple, I guess, the eavesdropping and stuff. Those little snippets of things where you're questioning the context and wondering if you're being led down a breadcrumb trail that doesn't lead anywhere.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
know, there was a lot of that going on. Curious motives.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of curious motives. It was interesting to see how it all came together, but at the same time, it leaves you guessing because there's characters that you're rooting for. Like I know I was rooting for Pix. I know that I didn't want Omar to be the bad guy. Like and it was interesting to see like the favorites that we pick, and we see it with all sorts of murder mysteries, detective novels, where they start and you kind of take your guess at who's going to be it, and then you either hope you're right and you fall in love with characters, and the character that you hope gets killed ends up being the good guy, and it's like, well, wait a second. So it's always fun to see all of those juxtaposed on top of each other like that. Juxtaposed. It's
Juxtaposed.
a new one. I'll write it down.
New book title.
But
I can see the timer is ticking down.
yeah, we got 7.5 minutes, and so it's too early still for us to go on our little 30-second. Oh my gosh, we're running out of time. So we're good. We're good. We're watching the time here. Um, it's just I find the interview with her so interesting because I have it up in the background here. And when you create a novel like this, you have to have characters. When you have characters, they're going to be based on something. They're going to be based on maybe experiences in your past, people in your past. You're going to take bits and pieces here and there because I can't imagine
Oh
it's
yeah.
easy to create characters, let alone like 15 for a story. I feel like a lot of stories will have like two or three main characters going around. But this one, you really had such a large cast and crew, and all of them were incredibly important to the story. Like I feel like if you removed any of them, it wouldn't be the same story.
Yeah, like a big jigsaw piece all coming together, which is what makes a great detective novel for me. And of course, the detectives themselves, like Ruby and Dina, are so easy to like, but uh, without being like, what's the word that I'm looking for? Without being such obvious protagonists. They're not perfect. They make mistakes. They fumble with things. They go off down the wrong path sometimes. They're tempted by things the same as everyone else is. They've got their own agendas. I find that refreshing in a genre where it's often like the detective's right. Also not an alcoholic detective, not a detective with with trouble at home, that kind of thing. A bit of a breath of fresh air in that genre.
That's a good point. I feel like there's always the story of the troubled detective, and it's always
Which
this
I love.
level, well, right, which is nothing wrong with, but I always feel like there's this level of character redemption within that. Whereas here,
Yeah.
like Ruby and Fiends were great. Things were going their way. Like they've really kind of put themselves together, and they've built something together, and it was nice, like you said, a breath of fresh air to have that completely different style of protagonist in this story. And throughout the story, they are still stepping out of their comfort zone. Like there was, oh man, I forget if it was Ruby or Fiends that participated in the walkway, that it participated in the fashion show, and I think it
I'm
was.
sure. I can't
Um,
remember. Yeah, it's
forget
one of
what,
them.
but it was made clear that it wasn't something she wanted to do. It was made clear that that was not just outside of her comfort zone, but also she was going to get judged by people around her and this and that. And it was interesting to see how the characters stepped up into these larger roles. And I think, as somebody like Ruby, the character described, created her own fashion house and was successful in that regard. I think it lends to these are the types of people to be doing that.
Yeah, it does a great job of portraying the girls as like very human, prone to all the same things as everyone else. I think they handled the catwalk thing the same way that most people would have, and that's like a little microcosm of the human. It's a bold statement I'm going to make. It's a little microcosm of the human condition, but it's a microcosm of the rest of the story as well. These are the girls are out of their comfort zone. It's kind of thrust upon them. You know, they have to step up to it. It's one of those little things that plays out time and time again across the story.
And there was a lot of, yeah, like you said, it played out time and time again. There's a lot of times where they had to kind of just adapt and grow or learn from and change. Like when they had the taxi accident, the car accident, the catwalk, there was always a problem. There was always a problem that would distract you from what was actually going on, because you know from the get-go that there's an issue with people copying dresses, but then we never really get to resolve that because life gets in the way and other problems arise, which I found really interesting and frankly way too real at times. Because as somebody who's ADHD as all heck, it's it's easy to go from one problem to another. Absolutely easy.
Oh, 100%. I had something really good to say there, and it's gone from my head.
Well, if it comes back, let me know. So we've got about 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure that readers know what's next, how they can get a hold of Rose. So Rose has a website, and that website, if I remember correctly, is rosedonovan.com. I will add the description and link and everything like that below. There are, I believe, 7 total stories in the how do you the Ruby Detective series, and they all sound phenomenal. So I would completely recommend, if you liked Death in Velvet, read the sequel. The sequel is called The Mystery of Ruby's Sugar, which I'm very curious about because it seems to have taken a very different tone from Death in Velvet. Um, but it's the artwork is unique, the depictions are unique, the storyline is unique, and just hats off again to Rose for writing a detective novel that strays away from the norm but keeps you even more so engaged than normal.
Fresh but comfortable.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Good book for holidays or cups of tea by the window.
Yeah, that's a great point. I need to think of what I was doing when I was reading this. I think I was just typical reading. It wasn't anything unique. I was just in my room reading, but it now that the sun is out and summer is up, it feels like it's the right story for that kind of cozy environment.
Yeah, man. Beer garden book.
And but thank you everybody again. Uh always really appreciate it. We're so sorry that Rose couldn't make it with us today, but if you have any questions for her, we'll put her website down below. You can shoot her an email, check her out, check out the sequel. And then if you've made it this far, this was Death in Velvet by Rose Donovan, and thank you all again. Have a lovely rest of the